The year was 1983. It was a time of great uncertainty and palpable tension. The world seemed to be teetering on the edge of an abyss, with every passing day bringing new fears and anxieties. The world was a tinderbox, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. Nations were on high alert and the atmosphere was thick with unease. The Cold War had cast a long, dark shadow over the globe, and the threat of conflict loomed large. The United States and the Soviet Union, locked in a nuclear standoff, watched each other with suspicion. Each side was armed to the teeth, with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over. The balance of power was delicate, and the stakes were unimaginably high. The threat of annihilation hung heavy in the air. The possibility of a nuclear war was a constant, terrifying presence. The images of mushroom clouds and missile launches were seared into the minds of people everywhere, a grim reminder of the destructive power that lay in wait. Every blip on the radar, every coded message, held the potential for global catastrophe. Military personnel were on constant alert, their eyes glued to screens, their ears attuned to the slightest hint of danger. The tension was palpable and the margin for error was non-existent. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. Espionage and counter-espionage were the order of the day, and every move was scrutinized with suspicion. Diplomatic meetings were fraught with tension, and military leaders were constantly on edge, aware that a single misstep could lead to disaster. In the heart of this volatile era, one man would face an unimaginable decision. A decision that would not only affect his own fate, but the fate of the entire world. The weight of this responsibility was immense, and the pressure was almost unbearable. His name was Stanislav Petrov, a man who, in the grand scheme of history, might have remained an obscure figure, but fate had other plans for him. Petrov was thrust into a situation that would test his resolve, his judgment, and his humanity. A lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, Petrov carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. His role was critical, his responsibilities immense. He was tasked with monitoring the skies, watching for any signs of an impending attack. It was a job that required nerves of steel and an unwavering sense of duty. Little did he know that he would soon stand at the precipice of history, a moment that would define not only his life but the course of human events. The decisions he would make in those critical moments would reverberate through time, shaping the future in ways he could scarcely imagine. At that time, fear was a constant companion. People lived under the shadow of the bomb, their lives marked by a pervasive sense of dread. The news was filled with stories of potential conflict, and the threat of nuclear war was a topic of daily conversation. The anxiety was palpable, and the sense of impending doom was ever present. The horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were etched into the global consciousness. The images of devastation, the stories of suffering, were a stark reminder of the destructive power of nuclear weapons. The world had seen the consequences of such power, and the fear of a repeat was all too real. The thought of a nuclear winter, a world shrouded in radioactive dust, haunted the dreams of millions. Scientists warned of the catastrophic consequences, and the public was acutely aware of the potential for disaster. The fear of a world plunged into darkness, of a future obliterated by nuclear fallout, was a nightmare that loomed large in the collective psyche. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The decisions made in those tense moments would determine the fate of nations, the future of humanity. It was a time of great peril, but also of great courage, and in the midst of it all, one man stood at the center, facing a choice that would change the world forever. Stanislav Petrov was not a man of grand ambitions. He was an ordinary man, living an ordinary life in the Soviet Union. He was an engineer, a problem solver, thrust into a position of extraordinary responsibility. His days were filled with the hum of machinery and the glow of radar screens. His job was to monitor the Soviet Union's early warning system for nuclear attacks. This system was designed to detect incoming missiles from the United States, a task that required constant vigilance. It was a role that demanded unwavering focus, a calm demeanor, and nerves of steel. The weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders every single day. Petrov wasn't a hardened general or a seasoned politician. He was a man who had found himself in a position where his decisions could alter the course of history. He was a man of quiet intelligence, driven by a deep sense of duty. His colleagues respected him for his calm and thoughtful nature. He understood the gravity of his task. Every beep and blip on the radar screen could signify the beginning of the end. Every day, he stared into the abyss, knowing that a single error in judgment could have unimaginable consequences. The pressure was immense, but Petrov remained steadfast. Petrov had a wife and children, a life filled with simple joys. He cherished the moments spent with his family, away from the tension of his job. He was a man who understood the preciousness of life, the fragility of peace. The laughter of his children and the warmth of his home were his anchors. But he also understood the ever-present danger of the Cold War. The tension between the superpowers was palpable, and the threat of nuclear war loomed large. He knew that the fate of the world could rest on his shoulders. One fateful night, this understanding was put to the ultimate test. The alarms blared, signaling an incoming missile strike. The data indicated that the United States had launched a nuclear attack. The protocol was clear: report the launch to his superiors, who would then initiate a retaliatory strike. But Petrov hesitated. Something didn't feel right. The system had malfunctioned before, and he had a gut feeling that this was another false alarm. He made a decision that went against protocol. He reported it as a false alarm, a decision that could have cost him his career, or worse. But he was right. The alarm was indeed false. His decision had averted a potential nuclear disaster. Stanislav Petrov, the unlikely hero, had saved the world from the brink of annihilation. September 26, 1983, began like any other day at the Serpukhov 15 bunker near Moscow. The early morning mist hung low over the landscape, casting an eerie calm over the military installation. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the ground. Inside, Petrov and his team were already at their stations, their eyes glued to the radar screens. They had done this countless times before, scanning for any sign of trouble, any blip that might indicate a threat. The routine was almost monotonous, but the stakes were always high. The atmosphere was tense but routine. Each officer knew their role, their place in the intricate dance of military readiness. Conversations were hushed, movements precise. The hum of machinery and the occasional beep of the radar were the only sounds that broke the silence. Then, at 12:15 a.m., the unthinkable happened. The quiet was shattered by a sudden piercing alarm. Officers who had been calmly monitoring their screens were now on high alert, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The siren blared, shattering the tense silence. It was a sound they had all dreaded, a sound that signaled the worst-case scenario. The room was bathed in the harsh red light of the emergency alarms, casting an ominous glow over everything. A message flashed across the screen: missile launch detected. The words seemed to hang in the air, almost surreal in their stark simplicity. It was a message that no one ever wanted to see, a message that could mean the end of everything. The system indicated that 5 nuclear missiles had been launched from the United States, heading straight for the Soviet Union. The trajectories were clear, the paths unmistakable. There was no room for doubt, no time for hesitation. The room plunged into chaos. Officers scrambled to their stations, voices overlapping in a cacophony of panic and urgency. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Adrenaline surged through Petrov's veins. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the urgency of the situation. He gripped the edge of his desk, trying to steady himself, trying to focus on the task at hand. His training kicked in, but his mind struggled to grasp the reality of the situation. This was not a drill, not a false alarm. The threat was real, and the consequences were unimaginable. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it fast. The Cold War had just turned red hot. The decades of tension, the years of preparation had all led to this moment. The fragile balance of power was on the brink of collapse, and the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. This was it, the moment they had all feared. The clock was ticking, each second bringing them closer to potential annihilation. The weight of the decision was almost unbearable, the responsibility immense. The Soviet leadership had to be notified. Retaliation seemed inevitable. The chain of command was clear, the protocols well established. But in the heat of the moment, everything seemed to blur, the lines between right and wrong becoming increasingly difficult to discern. Petrov had to act fast. Every second counted, every moment of hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. He weighed his options, his mind racing through the possibilities. But something didn't feel right. Amidst the chaos, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. Could it be a false alarm? Could the system be wrong? The stakes were too high to act on instinct alone. He had to be sure, absolutely sure, before making a decision that could change the course of history. The weight of the world settled heavily on Petrov's shoulders. Every instinct screamed at him to follow protocol, to sound the alarm, to unleash the Soviet arsenal in response, to trigger a chain reaction that would end in global annihilation. But something deep down gave him pause. The system indicated 5 missiles. A limited strike? It didn't make sense. A full-scale attack was more likely. He hesitated, his mind racing. He questioned the data, searching for any anomaly, any reason to doubt the terrifying information flashing before his eyes. His gut told him something was wrong. He decided to trust his instincts. It was a gamble, a leap of faith that went against everything he had been trained to do. He picked up the phone and reported a system malfunction. No retaliation, no nuclear war. The world held its collective breath.